Chapter 29. The House on the Road from the Workhouse. Mr. Holt looked as if he was in somebody else's garments. He was so thin and worn and wasted that the suit of clothes which one of the men had lent him hung upon him as on a scarecrow. I was almost ashamed of myself for having incurred a share of the responsibility of taking him out of bed. He seemed so weak and bloodless that I should not have been surprised if he had fainted on the road. I had taken care that he should eat as much as he could eat before we started. The suggestion of starvation which he had conveyed to one's mind was dreadful, and I had brought a flask of brandy in case of accidents, but, in spite of everything, I could not conceal from myself that he would be more at home in a sick bed than in a jolting cab. It was not a cheerful drive. There was in Sidney's manner towards me an air of protection which I instinctively resented. He appeared to be regarding me as a careful and anxious nurse might regard a wrong-headed and disobedient child. Conversation distinctly languished. Since Sidney seemed disposed to patronize me, I was bent on snubbing him. The result was that the majority of the remarks which were uttered were addressed to Mr. Holt. The cab stopped after what had appeared to me to be an interminable journey. I was rejoiced at the prospect of its being at an end. Sidney put his head out of the window. A short parley with the driver ensued. "This is Hammersmith Workhouse. It's a large place, sir. Which part of it might you be wanting?" Sidney appealed to Mr. Holt. He put his head out of the window in his turn. He did not seem to recognize our surroundings at all. "We have come a different way. This is not the way I went. I went through Hammersmith and to the casual ward." "I don't see that here." Sidney spoke to the cabman. "Driver, where's the casual ward?" "That's the other end, sir." "Then take us there." He took us there. Then Sidney appealed again to Mr. Holt. "Shall I dismiss the cabman, or don't you feel equal to walking?" "Thank you. I feel quite equal to walking. I think the exercise will do me good." So the cabman was dismissed, a step which we, and I in particular, had subsequent cause to regret. Mr. Holt took his bearings. He pointed to a door which was just in front of us. "That's the entrance to the casual ward, and that, over it, is the window through which the other man threw a stone. I went to the right, back the way I had come. We went to the right. I reached this corner." We had reached a corner. Mr. Holt looked about him, endeavoring to recall the way he had gone. A good many roads appeared to converge at that point, so that he might have wandered in either of several directions. Presently he arrived at something like a decision. "I think this is the way I went. I am nearly sure it is." He led the way, with something of an air of dubitation, and we followed. The road he had chosen seemed to lead to nothing and nowhere. We had not gone many yards from the workhouse gates before we were confronted by something like chaos. In front and on either side of us were large spaces of wasteland. At some more or less remote period attempts appeared to have been made at brick-making. There were untidy stacks of bilious-looking bricks in evidence. Here and there, enormous weather-stained boards announced that this desirable land was to be let for building purposes. The road itself was unfinished. There was no pavement, and we had the bare, uneven ground for sidewalk. It seemed, so far as I could judge, to lose itself in space and to be swallowed up by the wilderness of desirable lands which lay beyond. In the near distance there were houses enough, and to spare, of a kind, but they were in other roads. In the one in which we actually were, on the right, at the end, there was a row of unfurnished carcasses, but only 2 buildings which were in anything like a fit state for occupation. One stood on either side, not facing each other. There was a distance between them of perhaps 50 yards. The sight of them had a more exciting effect on Mr. Holt than it had on me. He moved rapidly forward, coming to a standstill in front of the one upon our left, which was the nearer of the pair. "This is the house," he exclaimed. He seemed almost exhilarated. I confess that I was depressed. A more dismal-looking habitation one could hardly imagine. It was one of those dreadful jerry-built houses which, while they are still new, look old. It had quite possibly only been built a year or two, and yet, owing to neglect, or to poverty of construction, or to a combination of the two, it was already threatening to tumble down. It was a small place, a couple of stories high, and would have been dear, I should think, at £30 a year. The windows had surely never been washed since the house was built. Those on the upper floor seemed all either cracked or broken. The only sign of occupancy consisted in the fact that a blind was down behind the window of the room on the ground floor. Curtains there were none. A low wall ran in front, which had apparently at one time been surmounted by something in the shape of an iron railing. A rusty piece of metal still remained on one end. But since there was only about a foot between it and the building, which was practically built upon the road, whether the wall was intended to ensure privacy or was merely for ornament was not clear. "This is the house," repeated Mr. Holt, showing more signs of life than I had hitherto seen in him. Sidney looked it up and down. It apparently appealed to his aesthetic sense as little as it did to mine. "Are you sure?" "I am certain. It seems empty." It seemed empty to me that night. That is why I got into it in search of shelter, which is the window which served you as a door. "This one." Mr. Holt pointed to the window on the ground floor, the one which was screened by a blind. "There was no sign of a blind when I first saw it, and the sash was up. It was that which caught my eye." Once more Sidney surveyed the place, in comprehensive fashion, from roof to basement. Then he scrutinizingly regarded Mr. Holt. "You are quite sure this is the house? It might be awkward if you proved mistaken. I am going to knock at the door, and if it turns out that that mysterious acquaintance of yours does not, and never has, lived here, we might find an explanation difficult. I am sure it is the house, certain. I know it. I feel it here, and here." Mr. Holt touched his breast and his forehead. His manner was distinctly odd. He was trembling, and a fevered expression had come into his eyes. Sidney glanced at him for a moment in silence. Then he bestowed his attention upon me. "May I ask if I may rely upon your preserving your presence of mind?" The mere question ruffled my plumes. "What do you mean?" "What I say. I am going to knock at that door, and I am going to get through it somehow. It is quite within the range of possibility that, when I am through, there will be some strange happenings, as you have heard from Mr. Holt. The house is commonplace enough without. You may not find it so commonplace within. You may find yourself in a position in which it will be in the highest degree essential that you should keep your wits about you. I am not likely to let them stray." "Then that's all right. Do I understand that you propose to come in with me?" "Of course I do. What do you suppose I've come for? What nonsense you are talking." "I hope that you will still continue to consider it nonsense by the time this little adventure's done. That I resented his impertinence goes without saying. To be talked to in such a strain by Sidney Atherton, whom I had kept in subjection ever since he was in knickerbockers, was a little trying, but I am forced to admit that I was more impressed by his manner or his words, or by Mr. Holt's manner or something, than I should have cared to own. I had not the least notion what was going to happen, or what horrors that woe-begone-looking dwelling contained. But Mr. Holt's story had been of the most astonishing sort. My experiences of the previous night were still fresh, and, altogether, now that I was in such close neighborhood with the unknown, with a capital U, although it was broad daylight, it loomed before me in a shape for which, candidly, I was not prepared. A more disreputable-looking front door I have not seen. It was in perfect harmony with the remainder of the establishment. The paint was off, the woodwork was scratched and dented, the knocker was red with rust. When Sidney took it in his hand, I was conscious of quite a little thrill. As he brought it down with a sharp rat-tat, I half expected to see the door fly open and disclose some gruesome object glaring out at us. Nothing of the kind took place. The door did not budge. Nothing happened. Sidney waited a second or two, then knocked again. Another second or two, then another knock. There was still no sign of any notice being taken of our presence. Sidney turned to Mr. Holt. Seems as if the place was empty. Mr. Holt was in the most singular condition of agitation. It made me uncomfortable to look at him. You do not know, you cannot tell. There may be someone there who hears and pays no heed. I'll give them another chance. Sidney brought down the knocker with thundering reverberations. The din must have been audible half a mile away, but from within the house there was still no sign that any heard. Sidney came down the step. I'll try another way. I may have better fortune at the back. He led the way round to the rear, Mr. Holt and I following in single file. There the place seemed in worse case even than in the front. There were 2 empty rooms on the ground floor at the back. There was no mistake about their being empty. Without the slightest difficulty we could see right into them. One was apparently intended for a kitchen and wash-house combined, the other for a sitting room. There was not a stick of furniture in either, nor the slightest sign of human habitation. Sidney commented on the fact. Not only is it plain that no one lives in these charming apartments, but it looks to me uncommonly as if no one ever had lived in them. To my thinking, Mr. Holt's agitation was increasing every moment. For some reason of his own, Sidney took no notice of it whatever, possibly because he judged that to do so would only tend to make it worse. An odd change had even taken place in Mr. Holt's voice. He spoke in a sort of tremulous falsetto. It was only the front room which I saw. Very good. Then, before very long, you shall see that front room again. Sidney rapped with his knuckles on the glass panels of the back door. He tried the handle. When it refused to yield, he gave it a vigorous shaking. He saluted the dirty windows, so far as succeeding in attracting attention was concerned, entirely in vain. Then he turned again to Mr. Holt, half mockingly. I call you to witness that I have used every lawful means to gain the favorable notice of your mysterious friend. I must therefore beg to stand excused if I try something slightly unlawful for a change. It is true that you found the window already open, but, in my case, it soon will be. He took a knife out of his pocket and, with the open blade, forced back the catch, as I am told that burglars do. Then he lifted the sash. Behold, he exclaimed, what did I tell you? Now, my dear Marjorie, if I get in first and Mr. Holt gets in after me, we shall be in a position to open the door for you. I immediately saw through his design. No, Mr. Atherton, you will get in first, and I will get in after you, through the window, before Mr. Holt. I don't intend to wait for you to open the door. Sidney raised his hands and opened his eyes, as if grieved at my want of confidence. But I did not mean to be left in the lurch, to wait their pleasure, while on pretense of opening the door, they searched the house. So Sidney climbed in first, and I second. It was not a difficult operation, since the window-sill was under 3 feet from the ground, and Mr. Holt last. Directly we were in, Sidney put his hand up to his mouth and shouted, Is there anybody in this house? If so, will he kindly step this way, as there is someone wishes to see him? His words went echoing through the empty rooms in a way which was almost uncanny. I suddenly realized that if, after all, there did happen to be somebody in the house, and he was at all disagreeable, our presence on his premises might prove rather difficult to explain. However, no one answered. While I was waiting for Sidney to make the next move, he diverted my attention to Mr. Holt. "Hello, Holt, what's the matter with you? Man, don't play the fool like that." Something was the matter with Mr. Holt. He was trembling all over, as if attacked by a shaking palsy. Every muscle in his body seemed twitching at once. A strained look had come on his face, which was not nice to see. He spoke as with an effort. "I'm all right. It's nothing." "Oh, is it nothing? Then perhaps you'll drop it. Where's that brandy?" I handed Sidney the flask. "Here, swallow this." Mr. Holt swallowed the cupful of neat spirit which Sidney offered without an attempt at parley. Beyond bringing some remnants of color to his ashen cheeks, it seemed to have no effect on him whatever. Sidney eyed him with a meaning in his glance which I was at a loss to understand. "Listen to me, my lad. Don't think you can deceive me by playing any of your fool tricks, and don't delude yourself into supposing that I shall treat you as anything but dangerous if you do. I've got this." He showed the revolver of Papa's which I had lent him. "Don't imagine that Miss Linden's presence will deter me from using it." Why he addressed Mr. Holt in such a strain surpassed my comprehension. Mr. Holt, however, evinced not the faintest symptoms of resentment. He had become, on a sudden, more like an automaton than a man. Sidney continued to gaze at him as if he would have liked his glance to penetrate to his inmost soul. "Keep in front of me, if you please, Mr. Holt, and lead the way to this mysterious apartment in which you claim to have had such a remarkable experience." "Of me?" he asked in a whisper. "Did you bring a revolver?" I was startled. "A revolver? The idea! How absurd you are!" Sidney said something which was so rude and so uncalled for that it was worthy of Papa in his most violent moments. I'd sooner be absurd than a fool in petticoats. I was so angry that I did not know what to say, and before I could say it, he went on. "Keep your eyes and ears well open. Be surprised at nothing you see or hear. Stick close to me. And for goodness' sake remain mistress of as many of your senses as you conveniently can." I had not the least idea what was the meaning of it all. To me, there seemed nothing to make such a pother about, and yet I was conscious of a fluttering of the heart as if there soon might be something. I knew Sidney sufficiently well to be aware that he was one of the last men in the world to make a fuss without reason, and that he was as little likely to suppose that there was a reason when, as a matter of fact, there was none. Mr. Holt led the way, as Sidney desired, or rather commanded, to the door of the room which was in front of the house. The door was closed. Sidney tapped on a panel. All was silence. He tapped again. "Anyone in there?" he demanded. As there was still no answer, he tried the handle. The door was locked. The first sign of the presence of a human being we have had. Doors don't lock themselves. It's just possible that there may have been someone or something about the place, at some time or other, after all. Grasping the handle firmly, he shook it with all his might, as he had done with the door at the back. So flimsily was the place constructed that he made even the walls to tremble. "Within there. If anyone is in there, if you don't open this door, I shall." There was no response. "So be it. I'm going to pursue my wild career of defiance of established law and order and gain admission in one way if I can't in another." Putting his right shoulder against the door, he pushed with his whole force. Sidney is a big man and very strong, and the door was weak. Shortly, the lock yielded before the continuous pressure, and the door flew open. Sidney whistled. "So, it begins to occur to me, Mr. Holt, that story of yours may not have been such pure romance as it seemed. It was plain enough that, at any rate, this room had been occupied, and that recently, and, if his taste in furniture could be taken as a test, by an eccentric occupant to boot. My own first impression was that there was someone, or something, living in it still. An uncomfortable odor greeted our nostrils, which was suggestive of some evil-smelling animal. Sidney seemed to share my thought. "A pretty perfume, on my word. Let's shed a little more light on the subject, and see what causes it. Marjorie, stop where you are until I tell you." I had noticed nothing, from without, peculiar about the appearance of the blind which screened the window, but it must have been made of some unusually thick material, for, within, the room was strangely dark. Sidney entered with the intention of drawing up the blind, but he had scarcely taken a couple of steps when he stopped. "What's that?" "It's it," said Mr. Holt in a voice which was so unlike his own that it was scarcely recognizable. "It? What do you mean by it?" "The Beetle." Judging from the sound of his voice, Sidney was all at once in a state of odd excitement. "Oh, is it? Then, if this time I don't find out the how and the why and the wherefore of that charming conjuring trick, I'll give you leave to write me down an ass, with a great big A." He rushed farther into the room. Apparently his efforts to lighten it did not meet with the immediate success which he desired. "What's the matter with this confounded blind? There's no cord. How do you pull it up? What the—" In the middle of his sentence, Sidney ceased speaking. Suddenly, Mr. Holt, who was standing by my side on the threshold of the door, was seized with such a fit of trembling that, fearing he was going to fall, I caught him by the arm. A most extraordinary look was on his face. His eyes were distended to their fullest width, as if with horror at what they saw in front of them. Great beads of perspiration were on his forehead. "It's coming," he screamed. Exactly what happened I do not know, but as he spoke I heard, proceeding from the room, the sound of the buzzing of wings. Instantly it recalled my experiences of the night before. As it did so, I was conscious of a most unpleasant qualm. Sidney swore a great oath, as if he were beside himself with rage. "If you won't go up, you shall come down." I suppose, failing to find a cord, he seized the blind from below and dragged it down. It came, roller and all, clattering to the floor. The room was all in light. I hurried in. Sidney was standing by the window, with a look of perplexity upon his face which, under any other circumstances, would have been comical. He was holding Papa's revolver in his hand, and was glaring round and round the room, as if wholly at a loss to understand how it was he did not see what he was looking for. "Marjorie," he exclaimed, "did you hear anything?" "Of course I did. It was that which I heard last night, which so frightened me." "Oh, was it? Then, in his excitement, he must have been completely oblivious of my presence, for he used the most terrible language. When I find it, there'll be a small discussion. It can't have got out of the room. I know the creature's here. I not only heard it, I felt it brush against my face. Holt, come inside and shut that door." Mr. Holt raised his arms, as if he were exerting himself to make a forward movement, but he remained rooted to the spot on which he stood. "I can't," he cried. "You can't? Why?" "It won't let me." "What won't let you?" "The beetle." Sidney moved till he was close in front of him. He surveyed him with eager eyes. I was just at his back. I heard him murmur, possibly to me, "By George, it's just as I thought. The beggar's hypnotized." Then he said aloud, "Can you see it now?" "Yes." "Where?" "Behind you." As Mr. Holt spoke, I again heard, quite close to me, that buzzing sound. Sidney seemed to hear it too. It caused him to swing round so quickly that he all but whirled me off my feet. "I beg your pardon, Marjorie, but this is of the nature of an unparalleled experience. Didn't you hear something then?" "I did. Distinctly. It was close to me, within an inch or two of my face." We stared about us, then back at each other. There was nothing else to be seen. Sidney laughed doubtfully. "It's uncommonly queer. I don't want to suggest that there are visions about, or I might suspect myself of softening of the brain, but it's queer. There's a trick about it somewhere, I am convinced, and no doubt it's simple enough when you know how it's done, but the difficulty is to find that out. Do you think our friend over there is acting? He looks to me as if he were ill." "He does look ill. He also looks as if he were hypnotized. If he is, it must be by suggestion, and that's what makes me doubtful, because it will be the first plainly established case of hypnotism by suggestion I've encountered. Holt." "Yes." "That," said Sidney in my ear, "is the voice, and that is the manner of a hypnotized man, but, on the other hand, a person under influence generally responds only to the hypnotist, which is another feature about our peculiar friend which arouses my suspicions." Then, aloud, "Don't stand there like an idiot. Come inside." Again, Mr. Holt made an apparently futile effort to do as he was bid. It was painful to look at him. He was like a feeble, frightened, tottering child who would come on, but cannot. "I can't." "No nonsense, my man. Do you think that this is a performance in a booth, and that I am to be taken in by all the humbug of the professional mesmerist? Do as I tell you. Come into the room." There was a repetition, on Mr. Holt's part, of his previous pitiful struggle. This time it was longer sustained than before, but the result was the same. "I can't," he wailed. Then I say you can and shall. If I pick you up and carry you, perhaps you will not find yourself so helpless as you wish me to suppose." Sidney moved forward to put his threat into execution. As he did so, a strange alteration took place in Mr. Holt's demeanor. Chapter 30. The Singular Behavior of Mr. Holt. I was standing in the middle of the room. Sidney was between the door and me. Mr. Holt was in the hall, just outside the doorway, in which he, so to speak, was framed. As Sidney advanced towards him, he was seized with a kind of convulsion. He had to lean against the side of the door to save himself from falling. Sidney paused and watched. The spasm went as suddenly as it came. Mr. Holt became as motionless as he had just now been the other way. He stood in an attitude of febrile expectancy, his chin raised, his head thrown back, his eyes glancing upwards, with the dreadful fixed glare which had come into them ever since we had entered the house. He looked to me as if his every faculty was strained in the act of listening. Not a muscle in his body seemed to move. He was as rigid as a figure carved in stone. Presently the rigidity gave place to what, to an onlooker, seemed causeless agitation. "I hear," he exclaimed, in the most curious voice I had ever heard. "I come." It was as though he was speaking to someone who was far away. Turning, he walked down the passage to the front door. "Hello," cried Sidney. "Where are you off to?" We both of us hastened to see. He was fumbling with the latch. Before we could reach him, the door was open, and he was through it. Sidney, rushing after him, caught him on the step and held him by the arm. "What's the meaning of this little caper? Where do you think you're going now?" Mr. Holt did not condescend to turn and look at him. He said in the same dreamy, far-away, unnatural tone of voice, and he kept his unwavering gaze fixed on what was apparently some distant object which was visible only to himself. "I am going to him. He calls me." "Who calls you?" "The Lord of the Beetle." Whether Sidney released his arm or not, I cannot say. As he spoke, he seemed to me to slip away from Sidney's grasp. Passing through the gateway, turning to the right, he commenced to retrace his steps in the direction we had come. Sidney stared after him in unequivocal amazement. Then he looked at me. "Well, this is a pretty fix. Now what's to be done?" "What's the matter with him?" I inquired. "Is he mad?" "There's method in his madness if he is. He's in the same condition in which he was that night. I saw him come out of the Apostle's window." Sidney has a horrible habit of calling Paul the Apostle. I have spoken to him about it over and over again, but my words have not made much impression. He ought to be followed. He may be sailing off to that mysterious friend of his this instant, but on the other hand, he mayn't, and it may be nothing but a trick of our friend the conjurer's to get us away from this elegant abode of his. He's done me twice already. I don't want to be done again, and I distinctly do not want him to return and find me missing. He's quite capable of taking the hint and removing himself into the e-wicket. When the clue to as pretty a mystery as ever I came across will have vanished. "I can stay," I said. "You? Alone?" He eyed me doubtingly, evidently not altogether relishing the proposition. "Why not? You might send the first person you meet, policeman, cabman, or whoever it is, to keep me company. It seems a pity now that we dismissed that cab." "Yes, it does seem a pity." Sidney was biting his lip. "Confound that fellow! How fast he moves!" Mr. Holt was already nearing the end of the road. "If you think it necessary, by all means follow to see where he goes. You are sure to meet somebody whom you will be able to send before you have gone very far." "I suppose I shall. You won't mind being left alone?" "Why should I? I'm not a child." Mr. Holt, reaching the corner, turned it and vanished out of sight. Sidney gave an exclamation of impatience. "If I don't make haste, I shall lose him. I'll do as you suggest, dispatch the first individual I come across to hold watch and ward with you. That'll be all right." He started off at a run, shouting to me as he went. It won't be 5 minutes before somebody comes." I waved my hand to him. I watched him till he reached the end of the road. Turning, he waved his hand to me. Then he vanished, as Mr. Holt had done. And I was alone. Chapter 31. The Terror by Day. My first impulse, after Sidney's disappearance, was to laugh. Why should he display anxiety on my behalf merely because I was to be the sole occupant of an otherwise empty house for a few minutes more or less, and in broad daylight, too? To say the least, the anxiety seemed unwarranted. I lingered at the gate for a moment or two, wondering what was at the bottom of Mr. Holt's singular proceedings and what Sidney really proposed to gain by acting as a spy upon his wanderings. Then I turned to re-enter the house. As I did so, another problem suggested itself to my mind. What connection of the slightest importance could a man in Paul Lessingham's position have with the eccentric being who had established himself in such an unsatisfactory dwelling place? Mr. Holt's story I had only dimly understood. It struck me that it would require a deal of understanding. It was more like a farrago of nonsense, an outcome of delirium, than a plain statement of solid facts. To tell the truth, Sidney had taken it more seriously than I expected. He seemed to see something in it which I emphatically did not. What was double Dutch to me seemed clear as print to him. So far as I could judge, he actually had the presumption to imagine that Paul Lessingham, the great Paul Lessingham, was mixed up in the very mysterious adventures of poor, weak-minded, hysterical Mr. Holt, in a manner which was hardly to his credit. Of course, any idea of the kind was purely and simply balderdash. Exactly what B. Sidney had got in his bonnet I could not guess, but I did know Paul. Only let me find myself face to face with the fantastic author of Mr. Holt's weird tribulations, and I, a woman, single-handed, would do my best to show him that whoever played pranks with Paul Lessingham trifled with edged tools. I had returned to that historical front room which, according to Mr. Holt, had been the scene of his most disastrous burglarious entry. Whoever had furnished it had had original notions of the resources of modern upholstery. There was not a table in the place, no chair or couch, nothing to sit down upon except the bed. On the floor there was a marvelous carpet, which was apparently of Eastern manufacture. It was so thick and so pliant to the tread that moving over it was like walking on 1,000-year-old turf. It was woven in gorgeous colors and covered with— When I discovered what it actually was covered with, I was conscious of a disagreeable sense of surprise. It was covered with beetles. All over it, with only a few inches of space between each, were representations of some peculiar kind of beetle. It was the same beetle over and over and over. The artist had woven his undesirable subject into the warp and woof of the material with such cunning skill that, as one continued to gaze, one began to wonder if by any possibility the creatures could be alive. In spite of the softness of the texture and the art of a kind which had been displayed in the workmanship, I rapidly arrived at the conclusion that it was the most uncomfortable carpet I had ever seen. I wagged my finger at the repeated portrayals of the, to me, unspeakable insect. If I had discovered that you were there before Sidney went, I think it just possible that I should have hesitated before I let him go. Then there came a revulsion of feeling. I shook myself. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Marjorie Linden, to even think such nonsense. Are you all nerves and morbid imaginings, you who have prided yourself on being so strong-minded? A pretty sort you are to do battle for anyone. Why, they're only make-believes. Half involuntarily, I drew my foot over one of the creatures. Of course, it was nothing but imagination, but I seemed to feel it squelch beneath my shoe. It was disgusting. "Come," I cried, "this won't do." As Sidney would phrase it, am I going to make an idiot of myself? I turned to the window, looking at my watch. It's more than 5 minutes ago since Sydney went. That companion of mine ought to be already on the way. I'll go and see if he is coming. I went to the gate. There was not a soul in sight. It was with such a distinct sense of disappointment that I perceived this was so, that I was in two minds what to do. To remain where I was, looking with gaping eyes for the policeman or the cabman or whoever it was Sydney was dispatching to act as my temporary associate, was tantamount to acknowledge in myself a simpleton, while I was conscious of a most unmistakable reluctance to return within the house. Common sense, or what I took for common sense, however, triumphed, and, after loitering for another 5 minutes, I did go in again. This time, ignoring, to the best of my ability, the beetles on the floor, I proceeded to expend my curiosity and occupy my thoughts in an examination of the bed. It only needed a very cursory examination, however, to show that the seeming bed was, in reality, none at all, or if it was a bed after the manner of the Easterns, it certainly was not after the fashion of the Britons. There was no framework, nothing to represent the bedstead. It was simply a heap of rugs piled apparently indiscriminately upon the floor. A huge mass of them there seemed to be, of all sorts and shapes and sizes, and materials too. The top one was of white silk, in quality exquisite. It was of huge size, yet, with a little compression, one might almost have passed it through the proverbial wedding ring. So far as space admitted, I spread it out in front of me. In the middle was a picture. Whether it was embroidered on the substance or woven in it, I could not quite make out. Nor, at first, could I gather what it was the artist had intended to depict. There was a brilliancy about it which was rather dazzling. By degrees, I realized that the lurid hues were meant for flames, and, when one had got so far, one perceived that they were by no means badly imitated either. Then the meaning of the thing dawned on me. It was a representation of a human sacrifice, in its way as ghastly a piece of realism as one could see. On the right was the majestic seated figure of a goddess. Her hands were crossed upon her knees, and she was naked from her waist upwards. I fancied it was meant for Isis. On her brow was perched a gaily apparelled beetle, that ubiquitous beetle, forming a bright spot of color against her coppery skin. It was an exact reproduction of the creatures which were imaged on the carpet. In front of the idol was an enormous fiery furnace. In the very heart of the flames was an altar. On the altar was a naked white woman being burned alive. There could be no doubt as to her being alive, for she was secured by chains in such a fashion that she was permitted a certain amount of freedom, of which she was availing herself to contort and twist her body into shapes which were horribly suggestive of the agony which she was enduring. The artist, indeed, seemed to have exhausted his powers in his efforts to convey a vivid impression of the pains which were tormenting her. A pretty picture, on my word. A pleasant taste in art the garnitures of this establishment suggest. The person who likes to live with this kind of thing, especially as a covering to his bed, must have his own notions as to what constitute agreeable surroundings. As I continued staring at the thing, all at once it seemed as if the woman on the altar moved. It was preposterous, but she appeared to gather her limbs together and turn half over. What can be the matter with me? Am I going mad? She can't be moving. If she wasn't, then certainly something was. She was lifted right into the air. An idea occurred to me. I snatched the rug aside. The mystery was explained. A thin, yellow, wrinkled hand was protruding from amidst the heap of rugs. It was its action which had caused the seeming movement of the figure on the altar. I stared, confounded. The hand was followed by an arm, the arm by a shoulder, the shoulder by a head, and the most awful, hideous, wicked-looking face I had ever pictured even in my most dreadful dreams. A pair of baleful eyes were glaring up at mine. I understood the position in a flash of startled amazement. Sydney, in following Mr. Holt, had started on a wild goose chase after all. I was alone with the occupant of that mysterious house, the chief actor in Mr. Holt's astounding tale. He had been hidden in the heap of rugs all the while. Chapter 32. A New Client. On the afternoon of Friday, June 2, 18, I was entering in my casebook some memoranda having reference to the very curious matter of the Duchess of Datchet's deed box. It was about 2 o'clock. Andrews came in and laid a card upon my desk. On it was inscribed, Mr. Paul Lessingham. Show Mr. Lessingham in. Andrews showed him in. I was, of course, familiar with Mr. Lessingham's appearance, but it was the first time I had had with him any personal communication. He held out his hand to me. You are Mr. Chaminel? I am. I believe that I have not had the honor of meeting you before, Mr. Chaminel, but with your father, the Earl of Glenlivet, I have the pleasure of some acquaintance. I bowed. He looked at me fixedly, as if he were trying to make out what sort of man I was. You are very young, Mr. Chaminel. I have been told that an eminent offender in that respect once asserted that youth is not of necessity a crime, and you have chosen a singular profession, one in which one hardly looks for juvenility. You yourself, Mr. Lessingham, are not old. In a statesman one expects gray hairs. I trust that I am sufficiently ancient to be able to do you service. He smiled. I think it possible. I have heard of you more than once, Mr. Chaminel, always to your advantage. My friend, Sir John Seymour, was telling me, only the other day, that you have recently conducted for him some business of a very delicate nature, with much skill and tact, and he warmly advised me, if ever I found myself in a predicament, to come to you. I find myself in a predicament now. Again I bowed. A predicament, I fancy, of an altogether unparalleled sort. I take it that anything I may say to you will be as though it were said to a father confessor. You may rest assured of that. Good. Then, to make the matter clear to you, I must begin by telling you a story, if I may trespass on your patience to that extent. I will endeavor not to be more verbose than the occasion requires. I offered him a chair, placing it in such a position that the light from the window would have shone full upon his face. With the calmest possible air, as if unconscious of my design, he carried the chair to the other side of my desk, twisting it right round before he sat on it, so that now the light was at his back and on my face. Crossing his legs, clasping his hands about his knee, he sat in silence for some moments, as if turning something over in his mind. He glanced round the room. I suppose, Mr. Chaminel, that some singular tales have been told in here. Some very singular tales indeed. I am never appalled by singularity. It is my normal atmosphere. And yet I should be disposed to wager that you have never listened to so strange a story as that which I am about to tell you now. So astonishing, indeed, is the chapter in my life which I am about to open out to you, that I have more than once had to take myself to task and fit the incidents together with mathematical accuracy in order to assure myself of its perfect truth. He paused. There was about his demeanor that suggestion of reluctance which I not uncommonly discover in individuals who are about to take the skeletons from their cupboards and parade them before my eyes. His next remark seemed to point to the fact that he perceived what was passing through my thoughts. My position is not rendered easier by the circumstance that I am not of a communicative nature. I am not in sympathy with the spirit of the age which craves for personal advertisement. I hold that the private life, even of a public man, should be held inviolate. I resent with peculiar bitterness the attempts of prying eyes to peer into matters which, as it seems to me, concern myself alone. You must, therefore, bear with me, Mr. Chaminel. If I seem awkward in disclosing to you certain incidents in my career which I had hoped would continue locked in the secret depository of my own bosom, at any rate till I was carried to the grave, I am sure you will suffer me to stand excused if I frankly admit that it is only an irresistible chain of incidents which has constrained me to make of you a confidant. My experience tells me, Mr. Lessingham, that no one ever does come to me until they are compelled. In that respect, I am regarded as something worse even than a medical man." A wintry smile flitted across his features. It was clear that he regarded me as a good deal worse than a medical man. Presently he began to tell me one of the most remarkable tales which even I had heard. As he proceeded, I understood how strong and how natural had been his desire for reticence. On the mere score of credibility, he must have greatly preferred to have kept his own counsel. For my part, I own, unreservedly, that I should have deemed the tale incredible had it been told me by Tom, Dick, or Harry, instead of by Paul Lessingham.